We'll do a review in Likutei Sichos in Chelik Choftes, volume 29. This is the first Sicha for the Parshas Teitzei. In this Sicha, the Rebbe explains we find the different prohibitions against mixing two different kinds, whether it is in garments or uh, linen and wool, or it's in animals plowing or mating ox and a donkey together, whether it is in the planting on the field of uh, grain together with trees, kilayim, the different kilayim. Also, basar b'cholov, meat and milk to mix them together. The Rebbe will explain in the inner manner of things why we find differences. What happens when you mix uh, two different species? What happens and the results of it, and because the results change, so that by when we talk about the field or the animals over there, there is a new creation that changes from the way Hashem set up the world. Each species is its own, as opposed to by garments, you're just putting the wool and the linen next to each other. There's no result that changes anything, and that's why that would be permitted by tzitzis and by Migdash Ezra. We'll go step by step. We're learning the Sicha Lilu Nishmas Harav Levi Yitzchok ben Rab Chaim Tzvi Tehei Nishmosu Yitzrura B'Tzrei Rachayim Teitzei Aleph. So first the Rebbe brings down the Pasuk in our Parsha. Gleich noch dem Tzivui of dem Isur Shatnis. Immediately after the Torah tells us the prohibition of shatnez, which is mixing wool and linen together in the garments. Zogt on Torah, Torah instructs Gedilim tase l'chal arba kanfis ksusacha v'gemer, that you should make the fringes on the four corners of your garment the mitzvah of tzitzis. Why did the Torah put the mitzvah of tzitzis right after the prohibition against wearing mixture of wool and linen? So from them was the zwei psukim stehen bismichas zelazeh, from the fact that these two verses are juxtaposed. They put them next to each other learned men up. So from this we learn up the halacha that gedilim tase lecho af min hakilayim, that the Torah is coming to teach us that the tzitzis, the fringes, the gedilim that you make to you, that you're supposed to make on your garment, can be made min hakilayim, also from mixture of wool and linen. As kilayim seinen mutter betzitzis, that kilayim is permissible by tzitzis. That means that the Torah wrote this halacha next to each other, that the mitzvah of tzitzis overrides the prohibition of shatnez. Normally we apply this, you can't, normal garments, ordinarily you cannot mix wool and linen, but for tzitzis, it's okay. That's why the Torah writes it next to it, that it overrides it. So what is find here, that even though the Torah doesn't allow shatnez, but in certain cases by a mitzvah of tzitzis, we find that it is okay. And a similar thing we also find, that the belt, the avnet that the kohen used to serve in the Beis Hamikdash was made out of kilayim. And this allowance of by tzitzis or serving in the Beis Hamikdash overrides the prohibition, is unique to the shatnez, which applies to garments, but the other mixtures, sort of not mixing an ox and a donkey to plow with them, or the mixing of different grain and trees, the kilayim, those we or different kind, those we don't find any allowance. That's the Rebbe going to ask. Al derech zeh gefindt man dem heter. In a similar way, we find this allowance from kilayim by the big de kahuna, the garments of the kahuna. Zwischen the big de kahuna, amongst the garments of kahuna, was kohanim trogen ba vedosim b'migdosh, that the kohanim wore while they were serving in the migdosh, is given their avnet. One of the four garment was the belt. Was is gemach geworden the gartel? Was is gemach geworden von Shatnes, which was made from Shatnes, as the Rebbe quotes from the Rambam. So we see that the prohibition of Shatnes mixing wool and linen is exempt first by the mitzvah of tzitzis, and actually in the service of the Beis Hamikdash we use Shatnes, but we don't find it in the other mixtures. Darf men verstehen? So we need to understand. As einen faran drei mine kilaim. There are three types in kilaim. The pasuk, when it talks about mixing uh, different species, different things, there's three kinds. There is bekarka, one in the growing things in the ground, ube behema and by animals, ube begodim and by garment. With the Torah rechen ze da ois, as the Torah uh, enumerates over here, behemshech echad, in one continuation. The Torah says like this: "Loisizra karmecho kilayim goimer." Don't sow your orchard kilayim, etc. Then it says, "Loisachrish b'sher b'chamer yagdov." Don't plow with the ox and the donkey together. And then it says, "Loisil b'shatnes goimer." Don't wear shatnes. So these three prohibitions of karka behema b'godim, not to mix it, the Torah comes in one. These are all kilayim. They're basically the same concept over here. The Torah, they one flow. Valderech zeh in Parshas Kedoshim. Similarly, in the Chumash Vayikra, in the portion of Kedoshim, over there it says also all three together. It starts with over there with Behem Tucha Lois Sarbia Kilayim. Don't make the behemoths, don't make them in kilayim, in different species. Sotcha sizra kilayim, and you don't breed them kilayim, and sotcha sizra kilayim, and don't mix the field, the different growing things. Ubeget kilayim shatnes lo alecha, and a garment of kilayim shatnes should not go upon you, not to wear it. So we see basically that these three different kilayims stem from one thing and the mixture. And yet we find a certain allowance only by begodim. Is my time, and what's the reason? Was kilei begodim, hotoyre matir given by avodah b'mikdash. The begodim kilayim, the Torah permitted when you serve in the Beis Hamikdash. That the avnet, as we said before, was made out of kilayim. So, which means that you're allowed to wear a garment of kilayim to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. And by mitzvah tzitzis, also by the mitzvah of tzitzis. Mashayin came by the andere zwei mini kilayim, as opposed to the two other different kinds of kilayim, which is by the animals kingdom, ubekarken, by the ground. Gefindt man it, ados sein mutter. We don't find that should be permissible by a mitzvah. The mitzvah, we should give an allowance for a mixture of animals or karka, or by kochim, or by when you make it holy, consecrate the animal, that you should migdash in the Beis Hamikdash or similar. There's no place we find any leniency, any allowance when it comes to a mitzvah or kachim. So it seems like shatnez is unique. And the Rebbe will later on explain, when we look into the source, the Rebbe bring down the Bechaya later on, that actually garments are in essence different than the other two kilayim, as we'll see later on. But first, the Rebbe brings down there is another level of kilayim which is not brought down together with these kilayim, but it's also a similar idea, which is the idea of basar b'cholov. Basar by itself is permissible. Cholov by itself is permissible. You're not allowed to mix them together. Basar b'cholov are not allowed to be mixed. And over there too, there is no allowance in case. But over there, the Rebbe will bring down, there's a thought in the Mechilta brought down, maybe it should be allowed. So we see that Basar B'cholov is actually a fourth, but it's a little bit different, and the Rebbe will explain that as well. Let's go step by step. Base. Oyser di gimel mine kilayim hanal. Besides these three types of kilayim mentioned, is faran noch an isur was is doime betoichnoi zu dem isur von kilayim. There's an additional prohibition which is similar in content to the prohibition of kilayim. Basar v'cholov. Milk, meat and milk. This is mevuer in Svarim, as explained in the Svarim, as der tam isur from basar b'cholov is kisoida kilayim, that the reason for the prohibition of meat and milk is as the secret of kilayim. Ataruves utzvei minim. This is a mixture of two kinds. Bos yeder farzich is muter. Each one by themselves is permissible. Nor bihis arvusom yachad. When you mix them together, then it becomes a matter which is prohibited. Okay, so this is another klal. But the Rebbe says over here, by Basar B'cholov, we find that there is a thought in the Mechilta that maybe that should be permissible when it's in the Beis Hamikdash. And it concludes, no, that it's not permissible. The fact that there is even a thought that you might be permissible shows that Basar B'cholov, somehow that mixture is closer to the mixture of garment shatnez, linen and wool. And that's why there is a thought, just like by the linen and the wool, we permit sometimes. Over here, it's only a thought that may be permitted. And the conclusion is no. So we find in the Mechilta as a sizdo akosal kodaitoch, that there is a thought as basar b'cholov zolzain muter b'mukudoshim, that basar b'cholov should be permissible when we're talking about things that have been consecrated. Maybe that should be allowed, that if you consecrated the animal, you should maybe lend the kohanim when they eat it, or you should be able to have a mixture, maybe cook it in milk, the meat over there. So there is a thought. But the Mechilta says, Norman Darshan them posik. They expound. The verse says, Reish is Tovi Beis Hashem Elikecha, that you should bring it to Hashem. And then the pasuk says, not to cook the goat in his mother's milk, which is the isur of basar b'cholov, as oich in Beis Hashem Elikecha, that also in the house of Hashem Elikecha, in the Beis Hamikdash, is though there isur from basar b'cholov, there is the prohibition against meat and milk. Kumtois. So here we see there is a thought by basar b'cholov, So by the other, by the karka and the behema, there's not a thought. No, there's no exception. It's always asur. By garments, linen and wool, there's allowances. By basar b'cholov, there's a thought. Maybe should be, but we conclude no. There are three categories in this issue. By kile begodim, by shatnez, the mixture of wool and linen, had the Torah matir given kilayim b'avedus hamikdash. Over there, the Torah allowed kilayim when you serve in the mikdash. V'yiseidim mezuzah gehasen, and more than just allowing it, avedus hamikdash, the Torah actually commanded. That's the way we make the avnei. The avnei is made of kilayim. By mitzvah tzitzis, there's also an allowance when it comes to the mitzvah tzitzis. You don't have to make it kilayim, but the Torah allows it to make it kilayim. So by the avnet, Torah says it's made out of kilayim, and by tzitzis you're allowed to. So that's one category. By basar b'cholov, by meat and milk, is da'akas al kadaitoch. There is a thought, the mechilta, maybe it should be permissible when we're talking about mukadoshim. Normal up for naposigas is also, but in the end we learn from the verse it's prohibited. By kile behema v'kile karka, but when we talk about the mixture by animals and mixture by growing things, is milachatchila nitokes salka daitoch as izon zayn mutar b'mukadoshim. To begin with, there's not even a thought that they should be allowed by mukadoshim. There's not even a question. Medarfa feeling it limud of that. We don't even need to learn it out. So you see that the mixture, it seems that the mixture of karka and animals is a stronger mixture, a prohibition, and therefore there's not even a thought for it to be permissible. Basar b'cholov, there's a thought is not as strong, and the least of it is mixing wool and linen. What's the difference? It's basically one principle over here. So it requires explanation. As the alle over the Monte Isurim haben themselves teuchen, since all the above mentioned prohibition have the same content, which is taruves von shnei minim. It's mixing two different kinds. Each one on its own is permissible, but bringing them together makes an isur. These are the common thread between all these four isurim. What is the time of the chilukim now? Why is the reason for this distinction between these isuri kilayim as it pertains to service in the mikdash, or similar to it also a mitzvah? So what is different between the different types of kilayim? So the Rebbe in Eis Gimel, and because of the differences we have different as it applies, that by shatness of clothing you can do it by tzitzis, and you do it in the big dekahuna by basar b'chol. There was a thought. So what's the thought behind it? What's the idea behind it? So the Rebbe brings down now the words of the Ramban, and the Ramban actually explains to us that there is a difference between the shatness of garments and the mixture of the field karka in the grain and the different and trees, and the mixture of an ox and a donkey. The Ramban explains also why this is used by the Gemara, that the Goyim, the Yitzhahara, complain mostly about shatness in the garments. Why shatness in the garments more than everything else? Because the others, it's more understood, explains the Rambam, because since Hashem created each species to be separate, when you combine the two species of an ox and a donkey, the result of it, if you breed them together, you're creating something that Hashem didn't create. Hashem wants everything to stay in the same kind. The same thing is like when you breed, when you have nurturing the seed from the tree, or the tree from the grain, you are not keeping the distinction that Hashem made, and you're making something different. But when we talk about garment over there, you're not really it's just you're bringing it together in two places in the same place. You have a garment of linen wool, but you're not really bringing any result. You're not making anything new. You're not changing the way Hashem created. That's why the Ramban explains the main objection of the Yetzer Hara and the Umas and the Yetzer Hara and the Umas Ha'olam is against the garments. This the Rebbe will use to explain also the difference that the Rebbe asked why we find an allowance, and then also explain Basar B'Cholov. Gimel. Wird man es verstehen, al pi Divra Rambam. We'll understand it based on the words of the Ramban. As dafke benegeya to the vicious shatness, that it's specifically as it pertains to wearing shatnez, ver dermont in Chazal, over there it's mentioned by our sages of blessed memory, as Yetzer Hara v'umas ha'olam mashivim aleim, that the Yetzer Hara and the nations of the world, they respond to that. In other words, they object to that. They challenge it. But they don't challenge kile behema. The Ramban explains that. Why? When there is mevayer, ados is the far. That's the reason. Was by kile begodim, when we're doing a mixture by garment shatnez, is the tam oifen isur nelam. The reason for this prohibition is obscure. It's hidden. We don't understand it. Mashenkim by kile behema, as opposed to when it comes to the mixture by the animal, and similarly, when we talk about the mixture in the ground, for statement and Tama Isur over there, we understand the reason from the prohibition. Explains the Rambam. That Eberster Bashafan the Nivroim in an Eifen, the Eberster created his creation in a way, as hat in the Tzmachim Ubalinefesh reingegeben, that he placed within these growing things and the living things, those who have a soul, the animals, arangegeben them koyach hatulda, humans too, bali nefesh. But we're talking about here in these species, they have them koyach hatulda, the power of birth, sheyiskaimu haminim, so that these species continue to exist. Vitzivani commanded, Sheyotziu limineim, so that they should produce, their offspring should be the same species that they are. Und therefore, when ein is ma'arif kilayim, if somebody mixes kilayim, is markiv shnei mine behema, he breeds two different species of animals. Or the shnei min Israelim, or two different types of seed, was durch them. When you breed them, what happens? They don't remain in their same. Yishtanu betivom, their nature changes. Gam betzuroso, also their shape, it changes. The fact that you breed them together or you graft them together, you change them b'yosem yonkim zamizeh, because they nurture one from the other. So every seed that comes from this mixture that you planted, the kilayim, all of a sudden it's as if every seed that you come, it's not anymore one seed, it's as if it has been grafted from two kinds. Is a mishane, so therefore it comes out that you're changing. Umakhish, and you're making weaker, arviv, and you're mixing in the creation of Bereshis. Because by doing something different than the Eibishter created, that the Eibishter brought in that koyach ha'iloda, to do limineihem, you're making change other than the way the Eibishter had planned it and made it. Well, one can argue that argument of the Ramban makes sense when we're talking about not breeding. But what about the Torah says not to use an ox and a donkey to plow together? You're not breeding them. But the Rebbe explains that this prohibition of not plowing them together is also based because the people that use the animals to plow with them, if you take two different species, then you put them back into the stable both together, and then they're going to be mating in there. So therefore, that is also for the same reason. So it's not a different reason. It's also you're changing things. Und das, was Teure sagt, this that Teure says as nicht nur that only the Torah doesn't just not allow breeding kilayim, the Torah doesn't allow to plow by harnessing the ox and the donkey together. Is mipnei shaderech, because the Rebbe quotes here from the Lashon uh, of the Mer Nevuchim, mipnei shaderech Kol oved ad mosei lahavit simdoi, because the nature, the way of those who work the field, to bring in the tzemeh, the pair, berefes achas in one stable, v'yavoi l'dei harkava, and they will come to breeding them together, to mixing them. So it's all basically the same idea. The bottom line is, over there, it's understood why you are prohibited. It has a reason. But the Ramban says, but the prohibition of garments, mixing wool and linen, you're not doing anything. Nothing is going to come of that. It's nelam. The reason is nel. Kum tois. So the Rebbe says, so it turns out from this Ramban, as es is do achiluk ikri, that there is a main distinction between kile behema v'kile karka and kile begodim, between the mixture of animals and mixture of the ground, as opposed to the mixture of garments. By mixture of garments, you're not really doing it. You're not impacting. By kile behema v'kile karka, when we're talking about the mixture of behema and karka, the kilayim by behema and karka, is that iruv oichendem koyacha hilod atulda. Over there, that mixture impacts the power of birth, of what is the result, the offspring, from the Shnei Minim, of these two types, what is the result? V'hainu, that means, as the Eruv poilt in an Iker. This mixture impacts something main, something, a main part. In Zeir Etzem Mitzias, this touches the essence of who they are, because there's going to be now a new species, is something new here, a new entity. Ubemela, it does benigut to sidre ma'aseh bereishis, and therefore this goes against, this opposes to the order of ma'aseh bereishis. As a zon zaylim and eudaf, the Torah said they should be to their species, the offspring should be in the species, and here you created something which opposes that that idea of the way the Eibishter created. It goes against the Ma'aseh Bereishis. Mashenkin by Kili Begodim, as opposed to when we talk about Kilayim by garments, is as Nitken Taruvis in them Etzema Metzias for the Tzemeru Pishtim. Over there, there's no mixture in the essence of the entity of the wool and the pishtim. You mix them together, nothing is changing over here. This is an external, you may put things together. It's you connecting the wool and the linen, you're bringing them into one place, into the garment. So the garment connects them, but there's no inherent anything happening. Aber euch noch them, but also afterwards, after you put them together, they didn't bring anything, change them. They remain wool and linen as they were. They didn't really fuse here. They're still their own place. But to the extent, later on, you can actually separate them one from the other. So that's the difference between the kilayim that the pasuk mentions over here, By begodim, you actually, and karka, the ground, by karka and the hema, you actually make a change in the essence, and you get a new species out of that, which goes against this ma'aser bereshis. By shatnez of garments, you just put together in one garment, but you didn't. There's no essence result. There's no essence change. What happens when you mix meat and milk? This is something in between. While there is no result of that, but the prohibition of milk and meat is only as the Rebbe when you cook them. The prohibition of the Torah is leisvashel. In other words, if you give just the taste of the milk and the meat, it's also not going to make it Torah osur. The isur of the Torah is to cooking. Cooking fuses them. But there is no result, there's no tulda, but yet it's a greater level of mixture. Dalit. Leidem is move on. So according to this distinction from the Ramban, as we explained, is understood as der geder v'hataruva is by bosor b'cholov, that the definition of how the mixture which takes place by meat and milk is via an oifen hamemutze. This is sort of in between, zwischen die zwei Efane Terubis Anal, in between these two different kinds of the mixtures that we talked about before. The Taruva is Bosser B'cholov, the mixture of meat and milk, is nit azavi kile behema v'cholu. It's not like the kilaim of the animal or the etc. The species of the that you plant, v'sirirt on them koyach hatulda, which would impact the power of birth. Hagidl v'atzmicha ledoides, the growth, the sprouting for generation. You're changing something. The taruva is bebosser b'cholov. That mixture of bosser b'cholov tut sich oif nit mer wie in zeir gashmis dike metzias. It only changes their physical entity, not the result. Bos kilayim by begodim doesn't even change anything. The linen stays by itself and the wool stays by itself. But by basar b'cholov, while it changes around you, becomes a new entity, but it doesn't impact the hayloda, the future. Aber li'idach. But on the other hand, basar b'cholov is this oich nit b'demet zu shatnez. It's also not the same as shatnez. Val bashatnez is this nit ken iruv gomur. Over there, it's not a complete mixture from the tzvei, meaning tzemer or pishtim, from the two species of wool and flax canal. Masha'enkin by bosor b'cholov, but when we talk about meat and milk, is doch der isum in ha-Torah davke. When does the Torah prohibition apply? When mi zeh mevashel yachad. When you cook them together, you have to cook them together. Und einer is neisen tam in dem zweiten, and one passes along the taste into the other, which means the milk and the meat and the meat and the milk, they both mix in together. There's a real taruvis. Unachber. And it's even more than that. It's not only that there is a real mixture, unlike by linen and wool, which each one stays separate. And here they get from each other's taste. The Rebbe brings down the halacha is that even giving a taste to one another does not violate the prohibition of the Torah of Lisavashal. If you should soak, you will soak a piece of meat a full day in milk. Usually the halacha is that if you use 24 hours, 12 hours, kavush is kimavushal. Having it soak in it, it's like cooking in it. But yet, if you would soak a piece of meat in a piece of meat in milk, so even though it's like mavushal, the milk taste went into the meat into the milk in a way, as just as if you would cook them. But menvek basar b'cholov kol hayoyim, you will soak it all day. But yoy beitaimen gives him time. That gives a taste. So even that mixture, hayoy says kavush k'mavushal, because something which is soaking has the status of being cooked so that the taste passes along there. But yet, is nitokin ismen HaTorah, you're still not going to be violating of cooking basar b'cholov. Nor davke durch bishul asra Torah. The Torah only prohibited actual cooking. Weil der isur basar b'cholov is shaykh nordan, because this prohibition of milk and meat and milk is only applies when man macht von the zwei minim, when you make of the two species ein naye mitzias, you fuse them and you make them into one new entity. It's not just that they taste from each other, but make them a new entity. That's the really the isur of bishul basar b'cholov. Was das kum davke durch bishul. That comes through cooking. So it's not only that it's more than shatnez of the garments, which is two separate, and they're not even fused at all. But if you hear, even the taste is not make it yet kilayim by or basar b'cholov. You need to cook it from the Torah. And v'yesh loymar adosis de hasbore b'das Rab Levi. This is actually the explanation of the opinion of Rab Levi. Normally, we know that in order to violate an isur, you have to have a kizayis. But Rabbi Levi's opinion is, as the shir kizayis from isur basar b'cholov, what is the amount of a kizayis by basar b'cholov? You don't need a kizayis from each one or one of them. Rabbi Levi holds as oirvens is no bloy zachatzi zayis basar, v'chatzi zayis cholov, a half of an olive of meat and a half of an olive of milk. Rabbi Levi says akizayis mein shneim. So amongst the two, you have a kizayis. It'll be osur. You don't have a shear in each one of them because we fused it, and this became a new isur over here. So therefore, it's one kizayis is enough according to Rabbi Levi. Val der shem isur leitzich, because the name of the prohibition of basar b'cholov nit auf dem basar bazunder und dem cholov bazunder. It doesn't apply separately on the meat and the milk as if they're two distinct parts. Nor beiden zusammen. This is the both together, their mixture. Wie sie seinen ein Metzias from basar b'cholov, as their one entity of basar b'cholov. So that's why milk and meat is taka mixture, but it doesn't impact any future. It's not the power of hiloda. So it's more than shatnez of the garment, which is just a connection in one place, but is no inherent in their mitzias connection. But it's not as strong as a mixture as the kilayim that growing, or the kilayim of the animals, in which it impacts their power of the procreation or the continuation of the species. And the Rebbe will now that we have distinguished between these three different kinds of the mixtures, the Rebbe will go in to explain the difference based upon the way it is in the source of things, that when you're mixing things over here, you're actually mixing things above in their spiritual level. And there we will see how these differences make a different application, and why by garments we allow the sometimes the mixture by big de kahuna, by tzitzis, and by the others we don't, as the Rebbe will continue to explain. I say, so you do of a state in Bechaye, it's known that, which stated in the Bechaye, as the inyan von Isur Kilayim, that the idea of the prohibition of Kilayim is not nor an irvuv begashmis. It's not just merely you're mixing things physically, nor oich was mis ma'arve v'hakoiches elyonim. It's also that you are mixing the upper powers, Hakilayim, chibur shnei ktsovis shem shnei hofkim. You're connecting two extremes, two corners, which are opposites. Ein chiburon oile yofa. That chibur does not sit well, does not go up well. When you're connecting things here physically, you're actually connecting things on a spiritual level. And if these are opposites, you can't really, the connection does not turn out well. That's what the Bechai says. This is what he explained by Kilayim. Similar when it comes to Basar B'cholov, he explains Zermevayir. As Basar B'cholov seine Nadugma Veremes, that meat and milk are an example and a hint to Dvarim Yuchodim Lamailo. They point to specific, unique things above. Each one has its unique things. Was the Taruva from Basar B'cholov Lamato. You're mixing meat and milk here below. Poil der Irvuv, that impacts a mixture from Dvorim Haim, from those items, was kol echad ve'echad darf zayin yuchad b'fnei atzmei. Each one of them needs to be by themselves, and when you're mixing them, you're causing a mixture above, lamailo. The act over here, mixture, so that's what he explained by Basar B'cholov, and also by Kilayim, that these are unique matters above and doing something below that mixes them. They shouldn't be mixed together. Uvis is mevur, and it's explained as semeru pishtim, that when we talk about wool and linen, or we talk about an ox on a donkey, or basar and cholov, zayin merames of chesed ugvura. They point to chesed and gevura, which are opposite, kindness and stringency. These are opposite traits. And that's why that connection does not go up well. So based on the above, that there is a difference in the mchiluk, siv gimel, in the mchiluk zwischen kile behema v'karko and kile begodim. That there's a difference between the kilayim of the animal and the karka, and also the kilayim of garments. Is move on as ich bin negeya dem irvu from the keiches helyonim. That also, when we're talking about to mix the powers of above, from chesed to gevura, was ein chiburim elu yofev, their connection does not go up well, it doesn't work well. Is do achiluk ikris zwischen the zwei sugim anal. There is a major distinction between these two categories, between mixing linen and wool on one hand, and on the other hand, mixing the different kinds in the ground and different kinds of animals. Also, there's a distinction between them. So, while the Bechai points out that these mixtures over here is no good because they impact the mixture above, which is opposites that shouldn't be mixed, but there's a difference to what extent how we mix them, whether they're mixed by shatnez, by garment, or by the field and by the animals. And also, as it's mixed by basar b'cholov. And the Rebbe is going to explain now why is mixture considered to be bad. Sometimes we say that chesed and gevura should be separate, but sometimes we talk about mixing them, and that's sort of a positive. The Rebbe will explain that sort of means peace to bring together opposites. And Rebbe will explain. Vo. Vetmanes verstehen behagdi matviele chayre will understand it by first introducing something surprising, which seems surprising. Oifun biura omer on the above explanation from the Bechaye, as kilayim uchibush nektzoves shem hofchim, shem shnei hofchim. That kilayim is connecting two extremes, which are opposites. Man gefindt, so it's surprising, man gefindt, as a chibur for shnei hafochim is adrabe, a mailach iniflo. To bring together two opposites is actually a tremendous, a greatness. Inyan hasholem, that's the idea of peace. Was kol ha-Torah nitna la'aseh shalom ba'olam. The whole Torah was given to make peace, to bring together opposite. Und einer von die ikre ha'avodah, and one of the main service of Hashem is to poil sein, his kalus hamidus, is to impact that midas should be included from one another. It shouldn't be gevura, chesed all by themselves. It should be a hiskalus. And the Rebbe brings down. Kidu Dambir Maimer Chazal, as known, the explanation in the saying of our sages, it's from Likutei Torah, it says, La'olam yehei odom rach kekona. Person should always be soft like a kona, like a stick, validei kosher keres, no, should be hard as a cedar. What does it mean? So the Alter Rebbe explains, as a mensch hot midas. A person has emotions. Aber darf haben weiche midas. Rach kakona means he should have soft midas. What does it mean? What does it mean, soft midas? A jeder mida git an ort zu der mida hofchis, that each emotion gives space to an opposite emotion. Val derech hamavur barambam, similar to what's explained in the Rambam, as al derech hayishore himida beinen is shebchol devadeya, that the straight path is the middle measure that's in each of the views, to go in the middle way, which means not extreme. So here we know that we should try to encompass other midas and not to just be extreme only one midah. Und da sagt man, as der Isur von Kilayim besteht, and here we're saying, what is the prohibition of Kilayim? It's them was mis ma'arev the midas of Chesed and Gevura, because that we're mixing Chesed and Gevura. Seems to be that doesn't seem to be a problem. State of them the beer in Torah explains an interesting point over here, that the hiskalulus hamidus in kedusha is al derech vitaruvis min b'minoi. We know sometimes you mix two items that come the same kind, and sometimes you have min b'she'enoi minoi. In kedusha, whether it's chesed or it's gevura, even though they're opposite, it's still considered to be min b'minoi. It's still the same. It's all kedusha. If it is not in kedusha, chesed is one, and gevura is opposite. It's min b'shein minoi, in one kind with another kind. But in kedusha, because they're all kedusha, they're not really so different. They're still the same kind. Let's look inside. Is al derech vitaruves min b'minoi, while all in yonim for kedusha, because all matters of kedusha, hakoilu min echad, it's really one kind. What is kedusha? Is habitl v'hachno elov yisborach, is the subjugation and subdue to him, blessed to the Eibishter. Und der Fall gefindt man, and that's what we find, as in avodas Hashem kenen sein beide midas hofchi, is the chesed gevura, that in the service of Hashem there could be two opposite emotions, the chesed gevura of kindness and stringency, zusammen, they can be together. Wie steht in Sifri al Apostel, v'ahavtas Hashem elikecha. The Sifri and the Post Gavsim Kelchos states that Ein Lochava b'mokim Yira v'Yira b'mokim Ava ela b'midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'levad. There is no such a thing as a love in a place where you fear. If you fear somebody, you don't love them. If you love them, you don't fear them. Ein Lochava b'mokim Yira v'Yira b'mokim Ava. There cannot be ela b'midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'levad. Only in the emotion. By Hashem, you can love Hashem and fear Hashem at the same time. But if it's not by Hashem, it's not the midas of Hashem, there cannot be both to love and fear at the same time. In Inyone ha'olam, aber, in worldly matters, cannot be. Was der Geder von ha'olam. What does it mean when the Geder is, was feels sich ametzias? He feels himself as an entity. In Kedusha, he is subjugated to Hashem. So he's not himself. All of his midas, everything are part of his subjugation to Hashem. But in worldly matters, was the gather for Neilmis was there feel sich ametzias. The definition from the world is that he feels himself as an entity, bis, as men ken mekayim zayin, durch mitzvahs, tefillin u'chayetzebay. It's an entity that he can do the mitzvahs. He can do tefillin and all mitzvahs. Is der Ziur von jeder mitzvah mit ha-toikef. So the shape of every emotion is with force. Unazat toikef, and such a toikef, such a strong toikef, was gibt nicht kein Ort für a zweite Mido, doesn't allow for any other emotion. It is a full formed emotion that is the entity, and that's there. Ubefrat, Amidov certainly won't allow for a not something else, but not an opposite emotion. Und therefore, ein lecha ave b'mokim yira, v'yira b'mokim ave. Therefore, there is no such a thing as ava in the place of yira, and yira in the place of ava. Ubemela. If you connect and you mix two opposite in Inyone ha'olam, in word of matter he says ba'oifum from taruvis min b'sheini mini. Then it's one kind and another kind. In kedusha it still remains the same kind, but in matters of the world it's a min b'sheini mini. I'm still struggling what the Rebbe meant by saying bis as meken it feels himself metzias, bis as meken mekayim zayin durch through the world mitzvahs tefillin. I mean, that is the extent that it's an entity. I'm not sure why the Rebbe is bringing down that example. Okay, Mashe'en came in kedusha. So this is in the worldly matters, mixing chesed and gevura, opposites, is opposites. That's not in the same kind. Mashe'en came in kedusha, but kedusha is in yona bittul tzumei, as opposed to kedusha, which is subjugation to Hashem. Zainen the midas havchis for chesed the gevura, then the opposite emotions of chesed and gevura nit be snagdus einer zum zweiten, they're not opposing one another. But on the contrary, they're really one kind. They're toichen v'inyan for beide midas. What is the contents of both the emotion? Is einer in the zelber. It's one and the same. Avodas Hashem, serving of Hashem. So the different expressions of Ava and Yira aren't opposing because they're both serving Hashem. This, the Rebbe says, is similar to the idea that we say Eisha Shalom Imreimov. Al derech vi Chazal zogen auf dem Posik Eisha Shalom Imreimov. Sages tell us in the pasuk that Hashem makes peace in the ones above. So what does it mean? Our sages explain the verse that what is the Memraimov? That Michael is Sar Shel Mayim. Michael, who is the Sar, the officer in charge of water, and Gabriel is Sar Shel Eish, the officer in charge of fire. They don't extinguish one another. While as they're standing before the King of Kings Hashem, they don't find their own force, their entity. They make peace. They only feel that they're agents of Melech HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore there's no opposition between them. Because they're all Beide Zayne Minechat Shluchim Melech. They're both one kind. They're both Shluchim of the king. Because they're both doing the Abeda. That means in the presence of the king. Being in the king's presence, they're not opposing each other because they're all doing the same thing. They're being agents of the Eberster. They fill their source. And that's why in Avodas Hashem, Ava can be together with Yira. It's still the same kind because the underlying thing, it's the service of Hashem, not the opposites of the Midah. Sei. Bei dem wird man verstehen dem Chiluk zwischen den zwei Sugim Anal in Kilayim. We'll understand the distinction between the two categories of above in Kilayim, the Kilei Behema V'Karka, the Kilayim of the animals and the ground, Kilei Begayim Begodim, and the Kilayim of the garments. B'shas man is mechaber u'ma'arvev zusammen zwei dvarim hafchim. When you connect and you mix two opposite, seine dort zwei Efshoriyus und Beufung von Teitzeis Hofchias. There's two possibilities, and the outcome are just the opposite outcome. Putting together opposites, what do you get from there? Either you get peace or you get a fight. They're separate is one thing. What do you do when you bring two opposites together? Either you get shalom or you get machlokes. Aleph. Number one, mizmevatel zeidet yurim hafchi v'seisrim. By bringing them together, like oiser shalom imreimov, you take away their oppositions. So they don't oppose each other. That's one outcome. The other outcome, base, Yederer bleibt betokvoi, they remain in force. When you bring them together, Werder funa plukto machloikes, so now you're making an argument. When they were separate, they didn't bother each other, but bringing them together brings the plukto machloikes. Und die zwei Fahne werden ausgedrückt in die zwei Suge Kelaim, these two ways, whether you make peace or you make a fight or make a separation in these two types of Kelaim. By Kile Behema Vekile Karka, when we're talking about the Kelaim of an animal and the Karka, was the mator in them is Loilid Minim Zorim Mishunim Beteldes. The point of mixing them is to give birth to strange, different, in their children, in the offspring should be different than their. You want from these two different kinds to create a change in the entity. Is the chesaron in them irvuv darin? So then, what is the problem by mixing it? Was durch them werden sie in battle als zwei besondere minim, because that way they're no longer, they lose their entity of being two separate species. Everybody according to their characteristic. Bringing them together, they lose their own characteristic. They create something new here. And which means, they are against the wishes of the Creator. Was Teitzei baschaffen als besondere Minim. He created them to be separate species. Und gewollt, als sie sollen verbleiben in seine besondere Gedorim Tafkidim. He wanted them to remain in their separate definition, their separate jobs, purposes, each one as they were created. And what they did, they nullified that level of creation the way Hashem had intended. Similar in the idea that we brought down in the presence of Hashem, that He makes peace amongst these angels. Isn't it that Pirush over there? It doesn't mean Adur Zeir Bittel zu Melech HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that when they became subjugated to Hashem, werden is battle die besondere Tafkidim von Michael and Gabriel. That the jobs of Michael and Gabriel cease, Sar Shomayim, Sar Shalish. They didn't stop functioning as each one. In the presence of Hashem, this would have been going against the wishes of the king. King doesn't want them not to be Eshamayim. Nur jeder bleibt bei sein Inyan führt durch Tafkidei. They're also, everybody remains who they are and they do their mission. Aber zusammen damit ist, wen mechabin zeh. They don't extinguish one another. So it's not that the bringing them together did not take away from them. The Eibishter, when the Eibishter wants things together, not to extinguish each other, but not to lose their purpose. When you're mixing kilayim of the karka or kilayim of the animals, and you're changing the birth, you're changing who they were. That's not what the Eibishter wants. That's going against the Ratzon Hashem, Leminai. But in the example we brought before, where the Eibishter does it, it doesn't make Michael and Gabriel, they don't have their function. They keep up their job. They just made, so that's going within the Ratzon Hashem, not like Kilaya Kerem or Kilaya Behema. Mashenkim by Kilaya Begodim is the Chison Nafakertem. Over here, what happens by Kilaya Begodim is just the opposite. Vibal dit Semer Pishtim. Bleiben b'mtziusam, it didn't really affect them because the wool and the linen remain intact. Un Aleph. Die koiches ilyonim was in Zeh, seien doch Shnei Hafachim, Chesed u Gevura. So these two powers that they have, Chesed and Gevura, base, as Retzach v'ginyone ha'olam, ba'velchas is nito b'goli. And when we're talking about, and yeah, just a regular garment, the person wearing a garment, ba'velchas is nito b'gilui, that inyan habitl, wherein we don't see the level of bitl, ubemela is a chibur ataruvis min b'shene mine. So it's a mixture of one kind with another kind. They don't really fuse. Vert fun zeir chibur v'irvuv. So when you bring together that connection and you make that mixing, at Teitzei hafchis, it's not that you're fusing, that you make an inyan for piruv machlokes, a separation and disagreement. When you put together wool and linen in one garment, and they remain one garment, and they remain each one. They didn't lose, they didn't fuse, they didn't bring them together, they're just brought together in one place. And you bring Chesed the Gemara, you're talking about a Metzias, then that brings Machlokes. When you bring together Kilaya Kerem and Kilayim of behemoths, over there you change what the Eibishter's goal was. When you bring together to be separate species. When you bring together wool and linen, you're creating machlokes. But as the Rebbe will explain, that's only if it's in Yonei Ha'olam, as the Rebbe will explain later on. But in the meantime, the Rebbe is going to say, what is the idea by Basar B'cholov? No, the Rebbe explains now the difference as it pertains to the Beis Hamikdash. Because the opposites that we have in garments is because it's in Yonah Olam, as the Rebbe says. So you make conflict. But in Kedusha, it's not necessarily conflict. As we said before, the Chesed, the Gevura, when it's in the Avneit, when it's in the Tzitzis, in Kedusha, they're not really opposing each other. So therefore, bringing them together could be an allowance. In a case where they don't really create something different than the Eibishter's Ratzon. The only difference is, the only reason is because they create conflict. But in Kedusha, they don't create the conflict. Yes. Apikol anal kemen euch masber sein, the drei chilukim anal, Siv Beis. The three differences in Siv Beis, benegeya to Migdosh, as it pertains to Migdosh. Why is shatnez permitted and basar b'cholov is a thought that it might be permitted, and kilai kerem and kilai behema is not permitted. The tamay von heter von kilayim b'tzitzis. What is the reason why we can make kilayim by tzitzis? And also as it pertains to the service of the mikdash is, while in an inyan for mitzvah kedusha, when we talk about a matter of mitzvah kedusha, midis hakodesh baruch hu, tut sich oif durch an iruf of shnei hafachim. Of then, when you mix two opposite, nit ke pirudo machloikis. It doesn't bring about separation and argument. Not adrab. Shalom v'achdus kinal baruch. Over there, when we talk about by the Eibishter's measures, it brings shalom v'achdus, because they all have the kavanah of the Eibishter. So bringing together opposite midas is not machloikis. B'medvarim amurim in azasu kilayim, which is only in such a kilayim with an irvu fir zu pirudu machloikis, that the mixture in that case with fir zu pirudu machloikis, mixing wool and linen, which brings to machlokes. Over there, we're saying, but when you're doing it in kedusha, it doesn't bring machlokes over there. Because the chisorn is not shaykh by a dover mitzvah kedusha. So if the problem of that taruvis by shatnez, by garments, which it leads to machlokes, over there, it doesn't apply to kedusha. By dover mitzvah kedusha, by dover mitzvah kedusha, there's no machlokes. Over in azaz su kilayim with the irvuv is mevatel dam limineim, but if the mixture just changes around the limineim, the order in which each one needs to remain distinct, the sidra habri, the order of creation, is kenaf kemin nitzias. That's wegen yonah olam, oder wegen advar mitzvah kedusha. Makes no difference if we're talking about worldly matters or we're talking about a matter of mitzvah kedusha. Bechol oifen torn nit bottle werden die gevulis was der Eibishter eingestellt. And either way, you cannot interfere with the boundaries that the Eibishter set up. There's no allowance for kedusha, because over here the problem is not the machlokes, which was by shatnez, by garments. Over here the issue is that you're changing the nature of the way the Eibishter wants it to be. So what does it make a difference? If you do it in kedusha, you're still changing the nature. And the far is by kile behema v'kile karka, they're talking kasal kadaitach, and therefore, when we talk about the kilayim of behema and kilay karka, there's not even a thought. Afila as mizol zay mater zayin b'mekdosh. There's not even a thought to allow them by mekdosh. Davke by basar b'cholov, specifically by basar b'cholov. Why by basar b'cholov? Was yesh mokem loymar as es gehert zum Zug von kilay begodim. We can say that it belongs to kilay begodim because kinal siv dalet, that it's really two separate. You're not affecting the birth of the result of it. Is doch kesal gedait doch. Ados sein Mutter be Mukadoshim al derech vishatnis be bidikona. Maybe you should be allowed by Mukadoshim, similar to Shatnis by Bidikona, because at the end of the day, we didn't really think that you're actually changing and you're creating a change in the Hiloda, in the Toldas, in the nature of Hashem. So maybe just because it's creating conflict, but in Kedusha there is no conflict. So that's why this thought is that you should be allowed to. Aber the maskone is as beis Hashem Elokecha lo yisvashel. That, as we learned from the Mechilta, that you should not cook koimer, while the geder from basar b'cholov is kinal. Because, as mentioned before, what is basar b'cholov? Bos meshaft ametzius chadosha. You did create something new over here, not in the koyach of birth, but also in the entity. It says bedoimet zum suk von kila behema. So that's why this is similar to the mixture of the kila behema. Was der Eufon von Taruvis is also bei Mukadoshim canal. That way of mixture is also by Mukadoshim, as we said before, because this is creating something new, the result of this mixture, the Basar B'chol of a whole new entity over here. That is not allowed also by Kedusha. Only thing that is eventually allowed is Shatnez by garment, because garment don't really create anything. The problem is they create conflict. But in Kedusha, there's no conflict. Tess. The Rebbe brings down that a state in Bechaye, and it brings down in the Bechaye, as Ba'isa Azman, in the loss of love, in the time in the future to come, Yia Isur Basar B'chol of bottle. The prohibition of Basar B'chol of milk and meat and milk will be bottled. We also find by the Malachim they ate Basar B'chol. That means that in some cases that it was permissible in that time. Why is that? Based on the Rebbe's explanation before about Basar B'chol, we can explain it. Because as Geret Frier and Sivdalet, as those was Basar B'chol of Berta Metziz Chadosha, that meat and milk becomes a new entity, is nor benegeyes and geshem v'chemer. It only applies to its physical and material. Meat and milk becomes now a new physical and materialistic on the external part. Das rit aber nit on zeire koiches pnimis ametzias. It doesn't really impact their powers, their essence of their inner of their essence, of their existence. Therefore, is verstandig, from this we understand, as benegeya de koiches elyonim. That's as it touches the upper powers from the physical act over here, was in basar b'cholov, which is meat and milk, which is connected to their inner existence. That didn't really change, so it doesn't impact them. But is the taruvas al derech v'kile begadim. So that mixture is like kile begadim. Was jeder koyach verbleibt in seinem Metzias. Each koyach remains in its Metzias, so we don't have a problem by Mukadoshim. Und das ist der Chilik zwischen Zman Hazeh und Eis Zman. And that's why there's a difference, because it's like at that point when the inner is the main of the Taka didn't change anything. In Olam Hazeh from Zman Hazeh, in this world of now time, we only see the physicality, the materialism from every physical item. And since as it pertains to the physical and the material of the matter, is from the from this mixture of meat and milk that became a new entity, the fardaf oiskumen. So therefore, it turns out it needs to come out as apitine haTorah, that according to the laws of Torah, shenitna lamato in Olam Hazeh, that was given below be'eretz davke neshama beguf, in neshama the body is dos hataruves b'deimet sekila behema. It's a similar mixture in the kilaim of the behema. For it's also bad bar mitzvah, because there's a change in the creation of Hashem. Hashem can lost it love as opposed to the future to come. When the promise will be fulfilled, when God's glory will be revealed. And all flesh will be able to see that Hashem spoken, meaning the Dibur of Hashem, with the emes metzias von Shemayim v'chulu, is that the true existence is from the heaven, is nit zayin geshem v'chomer. We'll see like it's above. It's not the material and the physical material, nor the bidvar havaya. Pi havaya, we'll see the way it is above. Through v'chanasu, through which they were created, pi havaya diber. Which creates, vitalizes, sustains every nivra. That's what we will see. So when you see the power of above, so the same thing will be, basu b'cholov, it didn't really change. As mevetzen inim zayin emse metzias. You'll see the real metzias, the dvar havaya, and the koichesol yeneshva. You see the Hashem's word and the upper powers that are in the basu b'cholov. They are not negated through this taruves, through this mixture, because they remain the koyach, the different koyachas. And being that the world of bald die ganze Welt wird damit ins Dach werden, werden an Elam shel Kedusha, since the whole world will be refined, will be a level, a world of Kedusha, and an Elam Kodesh, the holy world, is Adrabe. On the contrary, canal, that Iru from Basa v'Cholov, to mix meat and milk, Chesed Gevura, in Kedusha, is an Inyan Chinayla. That becomes a very great, tremendous high level, making the peace between the different forms, Sholem v'Achdus. That's why the angels ate it, Avram Avinu, and that's why lost love will be permitted, because mixture is not essentially bad when they don't create a new Metzias. And in essence, milk and meat do not create a new Metzias. Only in the physical expression, the Gashmis of the materialism, they create a change. But it didn't change their koyach ha'eloda, their essence. The essence, they remain separate. And if they remain separate, and the world will be a Olam Kedusha, this separation is actually an advantage. And that will be the level of Shalom V'Achtos that will be revealed. This is Sichos Shabbos Parshas Mishpotim, Tov Shelamed Hey and Vov, and Tov Shin Mem.